It's good to be with you. I often talk about religion and politics, and we were just discussing that's the two topics you should never talk about in polite circles. But since this is Lutheran Church and we're able to talk about anything here, we can talk about religion and politics, I think. In the United States, of course, you can always see and hear a good bit about God in public. And I was returning by car from a family reunion a while ago when I stopped to eat in Texas, and this was the window of the restaurant. So I took a picture of it. Actually, here's a broader shot of the restaurant. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this restaurant. It's Whataburger. When I stop to eat, I only eat at the best places. But Whataburger is known for, it's a fast food hamburger greatly loved by a great many Texans. And you can see the window off to the left here. And I wonder what should be made of images like this in public places like fast food restaurants. Here's a t-shirt design that states the United States is one nation under God, and note the clever use of Jesus saves, which makes the USA the center, the absolute center of that phrase. If you want one of these t-shirts, you can order them at the link listed below there, and if that particular t-shirt doesn't appeal to you, there are several others expressing the one nation under God theme that you can just do a Google search and you'll find more than you care to see, probably. And then here's state of Indiana, a nearby state that made new license plates in 2007 that combined "In God We Trust" with the American flag, and those are optional in Indiana. You can order one if you want one, and they're on cars now all over Indiana. When I get my tax statement from my house property taxes, "In God We Trust" is in the background of my property tax statement. I don't know if that's supposed to make me feel better about the terribly high property taxes in Texas, but what does all this God in public language in the U.S. really mean? Not too long after I moved to Toronto, there was a new campaign that began, and I got on the subway one morning and I saw this and took a picture of it. And when I saw that sign in the subway and looked up and saw it, I took that picture and said, yep, I've definitely moved to a different country. That's quite a different mention of God in public than you find in the U.S. And I thought we'd pause a moment and think about what all this mention of God means in U.S. politics and culture. Does the public mentioning of God as such a regular occurrence in our country mean that we're a Christian country and we've always been a Christian country? The question about America's status as a Christian nation always arises with regularity, I think, particularly these days. Was America founded as a Christian country? 9 of the original 13 colonies had establishments of religion. All of those were some form of Christianity, different versions of Christianity, all Protestant except for Maryland. But they all had Protestant or Catholic establishments of religion. And after the Revolutionary War, many of those moved in non-establishment directions. New York in 1777 adopted a state constitution that did away with its establishment of religion, barred religious establishments, and other states followed suit. You can see from this chart, if you look in the disestablishment column, you can see how right after 1776, a good number of the states did away with their establishments in their constitutions. Only 3 of them continued establishments of any kind, and those were Massachusetts, which had theirs until 1833, New Hampshire until 1819, and Connecticut until 1818. When you consider the original state of religion at the time of the colonies, I think you also have to remember that there was Native American religion and spirituality that also added to the diversity of religion found in America. But of course, those two things, religion and spirituality among Native Americans, were not too highly regarded or respected by most Christian Americans, whether they were dissenters or establishment types. Native American religion was extraordinarily multifaceted. It was extremely diverse, radically pluralistic, and even though Native Americans practiced their religious beliefs throughout American history, they were persecuted as they did so. In fact, it wasn't until the American Indian Religious Freedom Act finally passed as late as 1976 that Native Americans were fully allowed the freedom to exercise their traditional religious rites and practices. Within that religious mix at the time of the Revolution and Constitution, one must also remember the presence of African American religious understanding and expression. Blacks lived nearly everywhere in the country at that time, with a significant population in New York, in Maryland, and in Delaware. And they maintained majority populations in Eastern Virginia and along much of the coastlines of Georgia and South Carolina. And by the 1790s, Black Baptists alone numbered around 20,000. And in addition, African American black leadership created separate Black Methodist churches that prospered, and those numbered around 15,000 members, about 1800, and grew exponentially from that time forward. But the religion practiced by African Americans can't be so easily categorized. African characteristics merged creatively with both Muslim and Christian practices in this country, and religious practice may have been abundant among African Americans, but it's worth noting that in 1800, less than 5% of the black population, roughly 50,000 out of 1 million black population in the United States at the time, were associated with any Christian church, less than 5%. This is a picture here of Omar Ibn Said, who his dates are 1770 to 1864. He's a Muslim from West Africa who was sold into slavery after being forcibly taken to America, and his autobiographical account is dated 1831. There were many Muslim African Americans who were brought by slavery to this country and where they were enslaved and practiced their religious expressions in whatever way they were able to do so in that kind of condition. White Americans, of course, attended church more frequently, but perhaps not as frequently as many might assume. In fact, we err if we think that the early history of our country looked anything like the church boom of the 1950s. Some of you may remember that church boom when so many church buildings were built and membership just took off in this country. Estimates place church membership in 1800 at about 1 in 10 or 1 in 15 Americans. It climbed higher by the end of the Second Great Awakening in 1830, but generally in 1800, perhaps around 30% of the population might attend church on any given Sunday, but considerably fewer than that, maybe by half, were actually members of any Christian church. White Christians certainly had the power, but Christians faced significant and serious challenges in controlling directions within the culture itself, including even whether self-identified Christians would even show up for church on Sunday. At the time Americans ratified the Constitution, at least 7 states prohibited clergy by law from serving in any particular, or in some cases all, political offices. The only mention of religion in the Constitution is in Clause 3 of Article 6, and it's these words: "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States." Now that meant, ironically, that with the passage of the Constitution, clergy were free to stand for election in any public office in the federal government, even though they were forbidden to do so in at least 7 of the states at the time. The Constitution actually opened the door for ministers to serve publicly, to be involved politically in ways that many of the states prohibited. Meanwhile, religious tests were continued in various states, and those, of course, communicated to non-Christians, at least the non-religious, that they need not apply. At the time of the Constitution, 11 of the 13 states imposed religious tests for all public offices. I looked this up just for the fun of it, and according to Wikipedia, if you can believe Wikipedia, 8 states today still have a religious test for public offices in their constitutions. But that language is no longer enforceable after Supreme Court cases from 1940 to 1961. The 8 states that supposedly have the language, I've not checked each of these myself, but they'd be Arkansas, Maryland, Mississippi, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas. Those 8 states required, up until 1940, a profession of Christianity or an affirmation of belief in God in order to be able to run for public office in those states. The religious test clause of the Constitution created a considerable debate during their ratification process, as you can well imagine. The Philadelphia Constitutional Convention accepted that language fairly quickly by a vast majority of the delegates. But when the Constitution hit the streets, popular opinion quickly voiced protest. Delegates at various state ratifying conventions voiced their dismay over the language. Here's but one example from Henry Abbott, who was a delegate in the North Carolina state ratifying convention. He warned that the exclusion of religious tests was dangerous and impolitic, and that pagans, deists, and Mohammedans might obtain offices among us. If there's no religious test, he asked, to whom will they swear support? The ancient pagan gods of Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, or Pluto? Very concerned about having a no religious test clause in the Constitution. But even worse, the Constitution as it was sent to the states had absolutely no mention of God. It was, and is, a completely secular document. And that led to an immediate campaign to defeat the Constitution's ratification unless recognition of God was added to the Constitution. And those who led the charge and those who fended it off took one another on through most of 1787 and 1788, and those defending the secular nature of the Constitution won. And the adoption of this secular Constitution belies the idea that a majority of founders supported the notion of a formally Christian country. It also actually proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that American leadership actually rejected establishing a formal Christian nation. Considerable significance attaches to the fact that a secular constitution prevailed in this country in spite of strong opposition, and its adoption shows just how strongly the founders and leaders of the various states were committed to the idea that the federal government must be neither Christian nor even explicitly religious. Unquestioned Protestant predominance in the 18th century makes it all the more noteworthy that strong critics of Article 6 of the Constitution were defeated during those arguments in 1787 and 1788. Protestants had it within their power to make the Constitution explicitly Christian. At the very least, they had it within their power to bar non-Christians from holding public office, but they did neither. A secular constitution guaranteed that no particular form of religion holds any kind of peculiar advantage in the public life of this nation. Members of all religions, citizens who affirm no religion, stand on level ground with one another. Though many Christians believe that the Constitution, with no mention of God and no provision that leaders even affirm God in order to stand for office, emphasized that faith did not need government in order to survive. Thomas Jefferson explained that truth could stand on its own. Significant numbers of Christian dissenters experienced prosecution and persecution at the hands of government in the past, government that had been entrusted with religious powers. They didn't want that to happen in the United States. And others noted how religious tests only encouraged hypocrisy from those who came up with confessions of faith in order to qualify for public office. The Godless Constitution actually survived many, many other attempts through American history to try to bring God into the document. For example, Horace Bushnell, who was a congregational minister and theologian who lived in Hartford, Connecticut during the Civil War, a rather well-known theologian who's known especially for his work in Christian education, wrote a famous book called Christian Nurture. He condemned the godless theorizing that was behind the Constitution, and he urged Congress to recognize God in the document. And there were many others at the time of the Civil War who joined Bushnell in this effort, and they came together and created the National Association for the Amendment to the Constitution. And here you see within their own Constitution and address of this new National Association, their efforts to try to bring God into the American Constitution. These efforts continued from 1863 to 1894 to 1910 to 1947 and 1954. All those years created a massive effort by this organization to try to get the Constitution of the United States changed to include God in the document. And here you can see the language that they wanted in the constitutional document. We, the people of the United States, humbly acknowledging Almighty God as the source of all authority and power in civil government, the Lord Jesus Christ as the ruler among nations, his revealed will as of supreme authority in order to constitute a Christian government. This was the language that they tried throughout those many decades to bring into the Constitution, and at every point they were defeated. The Constitution remains intentionally secular in spite of these repeated, serious efforts to change it. The American people have somehow been able to maintain sensibility that religious freedom meant something more than just the ability of Christians of various stripes to practice their faith unhindered by government's influence. It also meant the rights associated with all religious expressions and no religious expressions. All those rights had to be tolerated, respected in this country if we meant to live up to the ideals expressed in the Constitution. Many Americans, like Madison and Jefferson before them, have long believed that protection of the religious conscience demands a secular constitution. Now, the interesting point is here that a secular constitution does not guarantee a secular public square. Rather, by being secular, the Constitution actually guarantees the opposite, that religion is free to speak in public ways according to the dictates of the religious conscience. Some wanted to guarantee that right explicitly through enacting a constitutional Bill of Rights. Now, James Madison, who I've come to learn, that Madison, Wisconsin is named after James Madison. Didn't know that little tidbit. But Madison believed the first thing we had to do was ratify the Constitution. Then we'll attend to the issue of a Bill of Rights. So to that end, James Madison met with John Leland, who's a Baptist leader from Virginia, who persuasively had been arguing against ratification in Virginia, primarily because the Constitution guaranteed there was no guarantee of religious freedom in the Constitution. And the two of them met in 1788 in Orange County, Virginia, near the intersection of what is today known as Constitution Highway, which is State Highway 20, and Clifton Road, which is Country Route 628. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Virginia and seen this marker, but this marker sits at the spot in what's now called the Leland-Madison Monumental Park, where they met. In exchange for a promise to support Leland's objective of a Bill of Rights, when Madison promised Leland he would support the creation of a Bill of Rights, then Leland promised his support for ratification of the Constitution in Virginia. And Leland also helped Madison and others defend the secular nature of the Constitution. So after strong rhetorical efforts by Patrick Henry to defeat the Constitution's ratification in Virginia, by a mere margin of 10 votes, the Virginia Assembly ratified the Constitution on June 25th. Actually, though, 4 days earlier, on June 21st of 1788, New Hampshire had already become the 9th state to ratify the Constitution. That made the ratification official across all the country. Virginia and the other states ratified it after that point. Then, after another summer of intense arguments, political wrangling, Congress adopted the Bill of Rights in 1789 on September the 25th. The substantive content of the amendments, those 10 amendments, can be traced to Madison's original proposal that he presented on June 8th at the beginning of the summer. There were some minor deletions, alterations of language occurred, but most of the substance of the Bill of Rights originated with Madison. And here's the final language of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Those 16 words, I think, are the most contested in American history about what their meaning actually means. No 16 words in the English language, I think, have ever generated more debate than those 16 words have. And even Madison knew that the meaning wouldn't always be clear. Near the end of his life, Madison received a letter from Jasper Adams, who was a reverend, and who was president of Charleston College in South Carolina. And the letter provoked him to offer some comments on the separation between church and state that had been set in place with the Constitution nearly 4 decades earlier. Madison believed the experience of the last 4 decades proved the wisdom of the American experiment, but he also knew that the relationship between religion and government wasn't always clear. It may not be easy, he wrote, in every possible case, to trace the lines of separation between the rights of religion and the civil authority with such distinctness as to avoid collisions and doubts on unessential points. In these brief comments, Madison gave expression to at least 2 different aspects of the American relationship between religion and government. First, he emphasized that experience proved the value of institutional separation of church and state. Religion and government are both better off when neither controls the affairs of the other. Secondly, he recognized the line of separation had ambiguous dimensions. The Supreme Court's repeatedly demonstrated the wisdom of that insight. In response to particular cases, the court's drawn the line first this way and then that way, and the line of separation has proven to be a very squiggly, very unstable line, illustrated more accurately perhaps by the type of line walked by a very drunk driver during a sobriety test than one you might draw with a ruler on paper. There's more substance to the relationship between religion and government in America than a mere concern for the line of separation can address, because the relationship between religious faith or values and public issues operates on a different plane. It's messier and harder to sort out. There's a tremendous irony in American history, in fact. The U.S. Constitution separates church from state, but no nation's public rhetoric, no modern nation's public rhetoric actually is more religious than the rhetoric one finds here in our country. The fact is, the constitutional guarantee to separate church and state doesn't guarantee the separation of religion from public life. Nor could it. In America, religion and public life are inextricably mixed together and extraordinarily confusing. When we stop to analyze it, we can note that all Americans are drawn into a good number of religious rituals associated with public life. And I want you to think about this differently perhaps than you've ever thought about it before. One of the things we understand is that in the U.S. there's been a long-standing tendency to attach sacred meaning to U.S. history, both to the activities contained within it and to the documents and monuments that emerge from it. American public life possesses many tangible items that generate a notion of reverence or awe that becomes attached to our own self-understanding as a nation, as a people. And many of those are not necessarily Christian in their religiosity. They may not mention God at all, but they do carry a strong sense of sacred meaning nonetheless. For example, there's something religious about the eternal flame at Kennedy's grave. Generally, it's a place for reverence. It's also true for the grandeur of the Washington Monument or the studied elegance of the Lincoln Memorial. The Lincoln Memorial references itself as a temple. You can see in the language there behind Lincoln's head. In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. All of these national locations operate as icons in our culture, and they evoke from those who visit them a sense of reverence, a sense of awe. And to some extent, the iconic structure of the American social world is necessary. It serves mostly to bring disparate people together, and all of us participate in it. This slide's a picture of the National Archives. Many who visit there get to get a first-hand look at the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. Have any of you been there? So several hands go up. Every night at closing time, or at the first sign of any threat, these documents, each one of them enclosed in a protective helium-filled glass case, descend 20 feet down into the bowels of the archives, into a fireproof, bomb-proof safe vault that's made of steel and reinforced concrete. And then the next morning, which is kind of a religious symbol itself, they rise up and take their place in the glass for people to see. Americans can't go to the National Archives without feeling a sense of awe as they view the original founding documents of the country. The same is true for all of us, I think, who've been to the Vietnam War Memorial. I don't care how you thought about Vietnam as a war, a wave of emotion overcomes all of us when we go to that wall. I've visited the wall on several occasions, and it's always a place for hushed conversation. Rowdy, raucous behaviors, terribly out of place in that sacred space. Now that's obviously less true at a place like a baseball game, where Americans stand together to sing the national anthem at baseball games, a ritual of American life. This is a good friend of mine, Joe Price, graduate of the University of Chicago Divinity School, who has sung the national anthem now in over 33 Major League Baseball parks and over 100 minor league parks. Beautiful voice. I could never be a Lutheran minister because I just couldn't sing the liturgy. I was just blown away by Mike's voice today. All these experiences, whether we're talking about the national anthem or the Vietnam War Memorial or any of these other icons of American life, they possess the ability to evoke something sacred about what it means to be an American. But outside these tangible icons, outside what we might describe as the iconic faith of America, we can also have a kind of almost superstitious, quasi-religious reverence for phrases, like, "In God we trust," or "Under God," or reverence for objects like Bibles in courtrooms that appear to function religiously for masses of people quite apart from any conscious awareness of the meanings or the critical associations that are associated with them in a Christian context, like, say, here at Bethany. The fact is, the iconic context is different from the Christian context, and it accomplishes something entirely different for those who enter it. What does this iconic context accomplish for Americans? First, we should understand that the iconic nature of U.S. public life helps Americans to make sense of who they are when they think of themselves as Americans. Robert Withnow, a sociologist of religion, explained that the very nature of our thinking, our social behavior, takes place in terms of symbolic boundaries that surround us. And those symbolic boundaries enable us to make sense of our worlds. Therefore, they are fundamental to all of our social life. I don't think I do injustice to Withnow when I suggest that the lines of these symbolic boundaries are often drawn into our consciousness as Americans by the public use of these icons and by the public use of these phrases. So iconic faith fulfills at least three purposes for us. It serves first as a cohesive force that has the potential for binding Americans into a common community. Secondly, it's an adaptive force which has tended to temper or modify or Americanize the various particular religious groups and peoples who make up American society. And thirdly, it's operated on occasion as an exclusive force, which tends to reject certain forms of otherness that cannot be or are not allowed to be assimilated into a relatively homogeneous Americanism. Some of you may remember the way that the example of Jeremiah Wright as an example of the way that how we think about what it means to be American tells us who is and who is not a good American. We let it control our understanding of such things. And Jeremiah Wright was pastor of Trinity United Church in Chicago, where Barack Obama attended for many years, and he was President Obama's pastor before he became president. During the Democratic primary in March of 2008, probably as a result of somebody connected to Hillary Clinton's campaign, several video clips of Jeremiah Wright's sermons were leaked to the press. And there was one sermon where Jeremiah Wright is pictured saying, "God damn America." News media picked up on that clip everywhere. Masses of Americans condemned Jeremiah Wright and concluded he was not a good American because he would say such a horrible thing as "God damn America." In fact, however, Wright's sermon prophetically spoke against this iconic faith that so many Christians in the U.S. have absolutely confused with Christianity. His sermon, if you listen to that sermon in its whole, preached about the history of racism in America, beginning with the treatment of Native Americans, rehearsing the whole slavery issue, the lack of voting rights, the inability of black people to get education, to get anything except low-paying jobs, and described how racism had gripped the history of America all the way up through its government. Government had failed the people of the United States, his sermon pointed out. And this is a quote of his sermon. And then, considering all these things, the government wants us to sing God Bless America. Jeremiah Wright said, no. God, not God Bless America, but God Damn America. For its racism. For it's treating its citizens as less than human, he said. God damn America as long as she tries to act as if she is God and tries to act as if she is supreme. But Jeremiah Wright himself was condemned because his sermon violated the iconic belief that God is always on the side of America. The first thing to recognize about iconic faith is it's not equivalent to Christian faith, even a derivative of it. There's a long history of religious rhetoric in America that has very little to do with Christianity or Christian meanings and expressions, other than the fact that the words or symbols have been borrowed from Christian and Jewish sources. When God language is used by presidents, or Bibles are used in courtrooms, or God is trusted on coins, the meanings associated with those things are not Christian. The uses of religious language from a symbolic context that often affects how Christians understand this relationship between Christian faith and public life in America is something different than Christianity. Americans don't think much about this aspect of public life. They're so used to it that we take it for granted. Most God language in American life, as in God bless America at the end of all presidential speeches, or God in God we trust that's printed on all our money or coins, or under God, which was added to the Pledge of Allegiance by a secular Congress in 1954. All these instances of God language are not meaningfully rooted in Christian faith, but they are good examples of iconic faith. 1954. You see her arm outstretched like this? Look at this picture of, this is actually a Disciples Christian Church in Cleveland, Ohio in 1919. Children pledging allegiance to the flag and to our flag. And I don't know, there's nobody here that would remember this, but we used to say, I pledge allegiance to the flag. And the arm went out like this. During World War II, as Hitler arose with the salute to Hitler, Congress got together and officially changed this gesture. First, they changed it to this gesture. It was this gesture like this, then to this gesture, and then to this gesture. And they officially changed it to across the heart when you said the Pledge of Allegiance. Of course, with this change, the Pledge of Allegiance, still captured the hearts of all of us as we grew up in school, and we said it every day. This pledge with under God language that was added in 1954 by a secular Congress because of the communist threat. When I grew up, you never heard communism without the word atheistic in front of it. And we were trying to differentiate our country under God compared to the communists who were atheists. That under God language in the pledges come under attack again more recently, and the Ninth Circuit in California ruled again on March 11, 2010 in that court case that under God didn't represent religion, it represented something they called ceremonial deism, and so therefore it was okay. It wasn't Christianity, it was ceremonial deism, and therefore it's okay. We can talk more about that in question and answer period if you want to, those court cases. But Americans possess a long history of the use of symbols drawn from Christian tradition for public life. And when Americans were searching for a national symbol, they were looking for what would define the new nation. Benjamin Franklin suggested the image of Moses parting the Red Sea, and Thomas Jefferson suggested the image of the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness. So in 1856, Benson Lossing sketched this great seal that was proposed by Franklin, showing the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea with the motto of the American Revolution around the outside. The founders rejected that image and settled on other images, and the back of any dollar bill has the images of the Great Seal. Don't know if you've ever noticed this before. And of course, all American money carries the phrase, "In God We Trust," which is the motto of the nation since 1956. E pluribus unum was the motto of the nation until 1956. Secular Congress in 1956 changed the motto of the nation from E pluribus unum to "In God We Trust," again in the face of the Cold War. But look particularly at the two symbols pictured there that represent the front and back of the Great Seal. Here you see on the right side of the bill an eagle with the olive branch for peace and 13 arrows representing the willingness to fight, with the words "E pluribus unum," out of many one, located in the ribbon to the left and the right of the eagle's head. And on the other side of the image is the image of the unfinished pyramid, which I've always thought is a pretty good image for government, actually. The pyramid is topped by the all-seeing eye of God. And above that is the Latin motto, "Annuit Cuitas," meaning God has favored our understandings, or God has smiled on our beginnings, kind of a roundabout way of saying God bless America. And on the bottom runs another Latin phrase, "Novus Ordo Seclorum," meaning a new order for the ages. Those two visual symbols are meant to capture the spiritual meaning of the nation as a nation chosen by God, favored by God for a particular fulfillment of a sacred destiny. So these symbols are co-opted by the public life for use in this iconic faith that defines all of us as Americans. And as time has passed, politicians and citizens have alike concluded that all American rhetoric about God and about America standing under God, and an early affirmation of the founders that was rooted in their recognition that America stands under the judgment, the authority of something beyond itself, of the divine, now routinely implies a kind of inherent minority, inherent morality of America, a chosenness, a special standing with God. And that's found expression in a belief that God is somehow especially identified with our institutions, with our way of life. And that rhetoric has nothing to do with the Christian claim that Jesus Christ comes from God because Christ is concerned with our redemption of all the human family and of creation. Rather, along the way, God becomes the one who is especially interested in America and the success of the American experiment, and makes no particular demands upon it other than it continue to succeed and spread to all corners of the globe. As Sidney Mead has once expressed it, God, like Alice's Cheshire cat, has sometimes threatened gradually to disappear altogether, at most to remain only as a disembodied, sentimental smile. Like God, the use of the Bible in American culture is also disembodied, sentimental. Americans have a rather superstitious, quasi-religious reverence for the Bible that has nothing to do with any real knowledge of its content. In America, public life, the Bible is revered as an icon, as an object, but it's not revered for its content. And we could actually run through a bunch of statistics, which I'm not going to actually take the time to do all this because we're running out of time. But you'll note that even though 92% of Americans own a Bible, only 16% claim to read the Bible at least once a day. Only 49% of Americans know that the first book of the Bible is Genesis, even though 92% own a Bible. 65% don't know the content of John 3:16. 35% Only 35%, 1 in 3, know who ruled Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. Only 40% of Americans can name who makes up the Trinity. Worse, only 34% know who delivered the Sermon on the Mount. Those statistics indicate the American public reveres the Bible much more than reads it. You see, the Bible of iconic faith is rarely read. It simply is. It's everywhere and nowhere. Everywhere in its presence, but nowhere in its content. Thanks to George Washington, a man who never meaningfully once referred to the Bible in any of his voluminous writings, it maintains a prominent place in all of our political inaugurations because Washington brought along his Masonic Bible, right across the street here, his Masonic Bible to his first inauguration, and after the oath was administered, he reverently kissed it. And today's politicians ignore the Bible at their inaugurations only at their own peril, because it operates as a sacred object to ensure truthfulness. And for similar reasons, the Bible finds a home among most of America's voluntary organizations as well. Even though they're opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, both the Ku Klux Klan and the Red Cross share the same transfer of leadership ceremony, swearing in their new leadership on the Bible. The same ceremonial ritual. In America, everybody likes to use the Bible for its own purposes, for their own purposes. What do these allusions to God mean? What does this iconic reverence for the Bible in American culture mean? Do they mean that America is truly a Christian nation, that dedication to Christ and to Christianity nationally meaningfully pervades all of our public life? Of course they don't. When politicians speak of God in their addresses or use the words of the Bible in the public arena, they're not interested in espousing Christian themes. In most instances, these uses do not even represent a nominal Christianity. Rather, talk about God or the use of passages from the Bible serve as convenient proof texts for expressing what one already believes to be true. In summary, a good number of Christians are confused by America's use of Christian allusions. This iconic confusion is represented in three particular circumstances, where cultural icons, like American flags, are used in sanctuaries of Christian worship. We become confused about the alliance between Christianity and America. Where Christians assume that the use of Christian images or icons in public life witnesses to America's commitment to Christian faith, when in fact those icons are created and utilized to support the development of American public life. Here's the example of Obama's use of Lincoln's Bible in his own presidential inauguration ceremony. And third, where Christians want to claim a prominence in public locations for icons that are specific to Christian commitments and beliefs and understandings, like stone monuments of the Ten Commandments placed on courthouse lawns, as if America was actually a Christian country. In all these three cases, Christians confuse iconic faith with Christian faith. And if that confusion continues, Christians face the possibility of sliding into what I've called priestly faith. And that's much more dangerous use of God in public. And I just want to give you two examples of this. Priestly faith is trying to point out how America aligns with God's purposes in history, or how America is God's purpose in history. Here's a Christmas card sent out by Dick Cheney and his wife Lynn, sent to friends when he was Vice President of the United States. I didn't get one, but I did see a copy of it. The Christian card contains the message that if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without God's notice, it's probable that an empire can rise. Is it probable that an empire can rise without God's help? In other words, America is an empire. We're an empire because we have risen with God's help. message here that America is an empire because God wants America to have this much power in the world. It's God's will that America be an empire in the world. For the priestly faith, the nation is the church. And it happens when, on the one hand, Christians attempt to legislate what they consider to be Christian behavior for the whole nation. But it also happens when Christians understand important national values to become normative for the whole church. Throughout American history, members of the church have accepted national values as if they were synonymous with God's will. Whether those values expressed slavery, segregation of the races, anti-communism, the need to protect family from the evils resulting from women joining the workforce in increasing numbers, gay and lesbian issues. We can go on and on and on in the history of American life and point out how national or cultural values become synonymous with Christian attitudes and get theological defenses placed behind them. The tendency to connect God's will with national initiatives, whether dealing with domestic or foreign policy, is essentially idolatrous. Priestly faith connects the national mission with the divine mission in the world. In doing so, it makes ultimate what is only relative. In the priestly case, ultimate loyalty belongs to the nation. Those who oppose that rightful conception of the nation, its mission, become demonic, become evil. That's true because opposition to the nation is understood to be opposition to God. Certainty pervades priestly faith. One always knows what's good, what's evil. America stands for all that's good in the world. Priestly faith always connects the nation and God, so there's virtually no difference. I want to close with this speech. Just a couple, it's not less than a minute.
Tomorrow, September the 12th, a milestone is passed, and a mission goes on. Be confident. Our country is strong. And our cause is even larger than our country. Ours is a cause of human dignity, freedom guided by conscience, and guarded by peace. This ideal of America is the hope of all mankind. That hope drew millions to this harbor. That hope still lights our way. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness will not overcome it. May God bless America.
At the very end of his speech, these are his words. This ideal of America is the hope of all mankind. That hope still lights our way. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness will not overcome it. May God bless America. Is that phrasing familiar to any of you? It's John 1:5, quoted exactly, word for word. Exactly, no shift in the King James Version of the phrasing. It's the exact word for word phrasing. That refers to the Word of God, Christ in our understanding, the Word of God, being the light. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness will not overcome it. In this case, those exact words, without quotation marks, and I got an actual copy of the speech itself from the Presidential Archives to make sure, no quotation marks, no reference to John 1:5. Exact quotation, now taken from a description of the Word and applied to America as the light, the hope of all mankind, the light that lights our way, and that light shines in the darkness. It resonated with evangelical ears. They heard it and said, oh, the Bush is quoting the Bible. But they didn't think about the fact this is idolatrous. This is taking what's applied to the Word of God and applying it to the country. And this is where this confusion between Christianity and the country becomes very dangerous. And it's one that all of us as Christians, when we don't think critically about the development of this language, the development of the use of iconic faith in this country, and how it's utilized to bring us all together, and how we participate in it as Americans, and we actually enjoy our participation in it, but we're not aware of the subtle ways in which it brings confusion in our minds of the differences between Christianity on the one hand and our belief in the country on the other. With that, I'll stop. I think we're going to have